Hello, poker individuals. This is Navinat on No Limit Hold'em. We're going to be talking about the major sets of initials and abbreviations of rock paper. Oh, Jesus, of No Limit Hold'em. I was going to do this like A to Z thing. I thought that was a little bit over the top or a little disingenuous, but we are going to talk about the fundamental theorem of poker, so the FTOP. Game Theory Optimal Strategies, so GTO, RPS slash Ace King Queen, or I'm sorry, AKQ. It's hard to even say A King Q as often as I talk about the Ace King Queen game. FTNT and BT, these are fundamental things that make it really, these are useful tools for thinking about and conveying information, but maybe they're not usually actually abbreviated out like that. So yeah, we could think of this as No Limit Hold'em A to Z, or by the letter, or something like that. But really what we're talking about are just the fundamentals, the kind of best learning and teaching tools. Little theorems, little rules of thumb, like opponent mistake propensity and relative hand value, so OMP, RHV for constructing lines, the FTOP as the kind of microcosmic view of the game spacer of NLH, or GTO as the macroscopic view. Then in this video, we're looking at rock, paper, scissors, and the Ace, King, Queen game. And as a poker coach, these have been two of my absolute most valuable teaching and teaching tools and allies in the quest to make decent poker minds into great poker minds. So what do I mean by the RPS and Ace, King, Queen? So the Ace, King, Queen game is it's a toy game. It's pretty famous, it's been around a while, and it's extremely useful. It's very, very useful when you are in exactly a polar versus bluff catcher situation. That's how it translates best into true no limit hold'em, where one player has a range that's all like nut value hands and air, and then the other player has a range that is capped and bound or condensed, where all of those hands are going to fall in between the two poles of the polarized range, the other player, the Ace and Queen player. So this is a situation where one player has a deck of all kings, and another player has a deck with all aces and queens, or you could just have a 3-card deck and play poker with just 3 cards. And this illustrates some, not basic, but fundamental principles. It can be used to really help people get their head around a lot of things, and we're going to get into those. And RPS, or the rock, paper, scissors of No Limit Hold'em, it just shows that there are these, it's a way of illustrating non-linear hierarchies, and talk about Nash equilibriums in kind of common ways of thinking, or a situation that we've all been in. So I think that we can use these two, well, what do we want to call these? These two games, toy games. We can use these two ideas to get a lot across in a relatively simple way, and I do that pretty often. There's definitely been some cases, some times where I've had a real hard time getting through to somebody and getting them to get a hold of a specific concept, especially, or for example, the way that we want to make binary adjustments very often when we figure out what our opponents are doing wrong. And the rock, paper, scissors game has helped me do that with a lot of success, with like tremendous, like sometimes, talking to this guy for forever, hours, days maybe, session after session, and cannot quite get this concept across. Finally, I invoke just a simple toy game involving or based upon rock, paper, scissors, and bang, there it is. He got it, and it's like this aha moment, and I can just kind of drop the mic and walk off the stage. We got it, you know, kind of a thing, with exactly the use of the rock, paper, scissors principle. Analogy, that's the word I'm looking for. These are just very powerful analogies. And I think in a lot of ways, it is fair to say that if you know just the rules of no limit hold'em, and you understand rock, paper, scissors, and the ace, king, queen game, and what they have to say about strategy, then, you know, really, you've just about got, you are really, really, really far ahead of people who don't have those. It's so huge. If every single situation you can look at through the lens of the ace, king, queen game, and realize that you're playing a game against an opponent in a similar way that you might with rock, paper, scissors analogy, everything else kind of lines up underneath these things. So once you get your head around these ideas, it's just you've got a really good foundation. So these are two of my favorite teaching tools, and these are the ones we're going to talk about first. Specifically, the ace, king, queen game is a toy game that illustrates the polar versus bluff catcher concept. When one player is playing a range full of bluff catchers and the other player has a polarized range, that is the ace, king, queen situation incarnate, or manifesting itself as an actual poker situation. So understanding this toy game, the ace, king, queen game, helps you to understand the polar versus bluff catcher situation very well. It also helps you conceptualize what your bets are trying to do and how they work together, how each part of your range works together. And it demonstrates how bad it can be to either put yourself in the situation where you have all bluff catchers, a capped range, against a player who's able to polarize their range. And it also shows you how good it can be to attack capped ranges with your polarized ranges. So there's just a lot of value in understanding this. And really, the ace, king, queen game is, if we want to be very, very specific, we could use this example. Let's say that you have a deck of 20 cards, and 10 of them are aces and 10 of them are queens. I have a deck of, doesn't matter, 20 cards, and they're all kings. So if we just play poker this way, we each ante $1, and then the player that has either the ace or the queen draws one of his cards. The other player just draws his king, as always. And then we have a round of betting. Our equities are equal. But what's going to happen in the actual game, if we play this out, is that the player that has the polarized range is going to be able to create or construct a strategy that the bluff catcher, the player that has the deck of kings, cannot hope to beat. In fact, if you're polarizing your ranges correctly, and if you're using the right strategy with the ace, king, queen game, as the toy game version, let's say that we each ante $1, I have all the aces and all the queens, and you have nothing but kings. I've got half and half aces, half queens, you've got all kings. Your strategy, let's say we ante $1 apiece, and we have the option to check or bet $2. Well, your strategy is going to be to never bet your king into my ace or queen, because you can only lose. I'm not going to fold my ace, I'm not going to call with my queen. And then my strategy with the ace or the queen is going to be to bet the ace 100% of the time and bet full pot. Like if that's well, we'll just keep it simple and say that is the rule. You have to bet full pot. So I'm going to bet $2 into $2 with all of my aces and some of my queens, but I'm never going to bet the king, and you're never going to bet the king. We don't bet the king. And that's an example of a powerful lesson you can take away from an understanding of the ace, king, queen game. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because if you've watched any of my poker strategy videos, you probably understand this. You know, it's just the ace, king, queen game. It's what I use all the time to talk about how if one player has an informational advantage, like he knows whether he's got the ace or the queen, but the other player has the king and just doesn't really know, he doesn't know whether he's going to be able to win or not at showdown. What a huge problem that is for the player that has the king. If the player that has the ace and the queen is able to structure a betting strategy with perfect information. That's one of the things that you'll see from this, understanding this, is just how advantageous it is to be able to make the nuts. Having the nuts in a no-limit game it's big. It's a really big deal. And it can also show you how bad it can be to have a face-up range that's capped. Even if it's like capped and bound. Even if it can only be so bad, just the fact that it can only be so good, it really can create big problems. Especially if your opponent knows what they're doing. An example might be a player who c-bets a polarized range. So he c-bet bluffs and he c-bets his top pair plus, but he always checks back his second pairs. Well, once that player checks back, then you, as the player who did not check back, let's say you're the big blind, you call, villain raises the button, you call, and the flop comes like king 7 deuce rainbow, villain checks back, or let's say it's king 7 deuce two-tone, villain checks back. Well, you know that all of your hands that have a king in them, and anything better than that, is effectively the nuts. So you can include any top pair, as long as the turn card is a blank, any top pair or any better hand, you can use all of those hands as the nuts, and you can put them in a polarized range and treat them as if they are the absolute stone cold nuts. And just, the damage you can inflict with that strategy. You could tell your opponent what your strategy is, and there's still nothing they can do about it. But normally what we're going to want to, the way we're going to want to think about the ace, king, queen game when we just first start learning about it is always bet the ace, sometimes bet the queen, never bet the king. If you are trying to, solve the game or figure out what the Nash equilibrium is, that's going to be for the game we talked about already, where it's a $2 pot and there's $2 that can be bet. You're going to bet all of your aces and half of your queens, assuming you're going to get dealt them each 50% of the time. What that's going to do is it's going to create a perfect indifference situation where you've made your opponent indifferent between calling and folding with the king. So if you bet $2 with 2 aces for every 1 queen, then that means you're giving your opponent a price of 2 to 1, and their king is going to win exactly that often. And so that means they're breaking even on their calls, and if they're breaking even on their calls, they're indifferent between calling and folding. If they're indifferent between calling and folding, then it must mean that the EV of calling is the same as the EV of folding. And if the EV of folding is that their EV is 0 and you win the pot, then that means that their EV is the same and your EV is the same when they call or if they fold. So even when they call, your average win will be the size of the pot. If you need to check the math on that, check the math, but it's like you bet $2 into $2. Your opponent has to call 2 to win 4, but they're going to lose twice as often as they win. So yeah, by calling, they're going to win some of the time, but they're going to lose, they're getting pot odds, yes, but the pot odds are exactly equal and opposite to the way you've constructed your range. You've constructed your range in such a way that their pot odds make them break even on their call. You've used 2 aces for every 1 queen, or 2 nut value hands for every 1 bluff. And that means a pot size. Now, it definitely makes a difference. If you're betting pot, then you're laying your opponent 2 to 1, so that means you need 2 value hands for every 1 bluff to keep their bluff catchers breaking even, and to effectively capture the size of the pot in the long run. So this is a very powerful thing. It teaches us about indifference. What should the player with the king do? He should call half the time, because that keeps us, the player with the ace or the queen, breaking even when we bluff the queen. And that's the best we can do. It just means that we're betting $2 to win $2. It's going to work half the time if our opponent folds and calls half the time each. And that's as good as the player with the kings can do, is he can keep our bluffs breaking even. But he can't keep us from making money with our value hands. So that's kind of where the strategy gets its bite from, is that exact notion. Now the other set of 3 letters is RPS, rock, paper, scissors. And what the rock, paper, scissors game can teach us is it can teach us to understand non-linear hierarchies. An example would be that, let's see, like there's all kinds of examples, but let's say we're talking about starting hands. Well, ace-king offsuit is greater than 9-8 suited. So if one player has 9-8 suited, the other has ace-king offsuit, they get all the money in pre-flop. Ace-king offsuit wins like 54-55% of the time, something like that. It's a pretty decent favorite, maybe 56% even. Okay, that should be clear enough. Now, what about pocket 2s versus these hands? Well, pocket 2s is a small favorite against ace-king offsuit. I think pocket 2s wins about 53% of the time against ace-king offsuit. So we've got, a pretty obvious hierarchy starting to arise. We can see that 9-8 suited is worse than ace-king offsuit, and pocket 2s is better than ace-king offsuit. So that should mean that pocket 2s is better than 9-8 suited, or it would in a normal hierarchy. But this is that would be a linear hierarchy. Poker works in a different way. The starting hands form a nonlinear hierarchy. A lot of things form nonlinear hierarchies in poker. It seems to be something about the nature of the game itself. So the actual nonlinear hierarchy of those starting hands would be like, since 9-8 suited is going to beat pocket 2s like 52% of the time, then we could say 9-8 suited is greater than pocket 2s, is greater than ace-king offsuit, is greater than 9-8 suited. There's our nonlinear hierarchy. The ace, king, and queen is like one half of this puzzle. It's on a different conceptual level. Rock, paper, scissors, it can show us about strategies, it can show us about starting hands, it can show us a lot of different things that aren't always intuitive, but they're not that unintuitive if you just look at the rock, paper, scissors game that you have played. The normal, let's play rock, paper, scissors. Okay, well, what's better, rock, paper, or what's the best, rock, paper, or scissors? I mean, the rock beats the scissors, and the scissors beats paper, and the paper beats the rock, so it's that same thing. It's that same nonlinear hierarchy, but it's the most obvious example, and it's the one we're all the most familiar with. So it helps us to understand nonlinear hierarchies, and it also can help us to talk about and understand a Nash equilibrium. Like, what is a Nash equilibrium? It's an unexploitable strategy. Two players reach an equilibrium strategy pair when neither player has any incentive to change their strategy. So if both of you are throwing rock, paper, and scissors 1/3 of the time at random, then you're in a you're in a Nash equilibrium. It's an unstable equilibrium because there's other, well, never mind that. That's the main thing though. If you throw rock, paper, scissors 1/3 of the time each at random, nobody can exploit you. Okay, now, what about if somebody doesn't do that? What if somebody throws rock more often than they should? What if they throw rock 40%, then they throw paper 30%, and scissors 30%? So this is going to show you how to make binary exploitations. How do we adjust to that? Well, if our opponent is throwing rock more often than the other two, well, that means that we should obviously not throw scissors as often, and we should throw paper more often. But how often exactly? Well, and the correct answer is no matter how this breaks down. So even as long as rock is the most common by any percent. So let's say that this guy's throwing rock 30. He should be throwing it 33 and a third, but he's throwing it 35 and a third, and he's only throwing the other ones 31 and a third each. I think I did my math right. But he's throwing rock any percent more often than he ought to. What's the perfect strategy? What should you do? Should you play scissors slightly less often and paper slightly more often? No, the correct strategy would be to literally never ever bluff catch a player that is under bluffing. Well, what do we mean? So if he's throwing the rock too often by any percent, then we should never ever play scissors, and we should always play paper. And that's true until he starts to adjust. And so that has a lot to teach us about how to exploit certain players and their tendencies. This has a lot to teach us about binary exploitation. That when our opponent does something a little less often than they should or would at equilibrium, the answer is very often not to adjust in a small way. Or like if our opponent is under bluffing, does that mean we should not bluff catch quite as often? Well, often it means we should bluff catch exactly never. In the same way, if our opponent is over folding the river in a polarized situation where we're polarized, they're the bluff catcher. If they under defend by any percent, that means that you should not just bluff a little more often. It means that you should bluff at every opportunity that you have. You should always bluff. You should bet all your air, as long as your opponent's under defending. More about that later. So what do we do with the ace, king, and the queen? We've already talked about that. Always bet the ace, never bet the king, sometimes bet the queen. And what exactly do we do depends on the pot size, depends on the bet size. But if we're betting pot, then what it really depends on is the price we're laying our opponent to bluff catch. So like if we bet pot, then we're giving them 2 to 1 to bluff catch. That means we have to have 2 value hands for every 1 bluff to keep them indifferent. But what if we're betting less than half pot? Well, if we're betting half the pot, what price are we giving them? 3 to 1. If we're giving them 3 to 1, then we need to have 3 value hands for every 1 bluff. So what about their strategy? What should they do with the king? Well, they should be bluff catching off enough to keep us indifferent between bluffing or not. Well, what does that mean? Well, that depends on the price we're laying ourselves. So if we're bluffing, doesn't matter. Let's say we're betting pot, we're bluffing 1 queen for every 2 aces, or 1 bluff for every 2 value hands with a pot size bet. That pot size bet determines the price that we're laying ourselves, and our opponent's job with his bluff catchers is to keep us indifferent between bluffing or not. So that means to keep us breaking even on our bluffs. If we're risking the same amount that we're trying to gain with our bluffs, then he has to call half the time. But if we're only betting 1/2 pot, then we're giving ourselves a better price. We're giving ourselves, we're betting half pot, we're only risking 1/2 as much as we hope to gain. So our opponent needs to bluff catch 2 times for every 1 time he folds to keep us indifferent in that situation. And what does this tell us about how to construct ranges and take lines? I mean, virtually everything. It tells us virtually everything. I don't think I'm going to try to define that at this moment. Let's move on to the Nash equilibrium for Raw. We already talked about that. What do we do versus a player who's not doing that? Well, we make binary exploitation. Now, there's something to be said for, not going after every dime you can possibly squeeze out of an exploit. I don't really agree with that most of the time in most situations, but there are outlier situations where I would agree with that. There's a school of thought that's like, don't tap the glass, right? If the fish is sleeping, don't wake him up. But I don't know. I kind of think just exploit the shit out of your opponent at every opportunity. What's he going to do about it? I mean, maybe nothing. Maybe he just rolls over and lets you win. Or worst case scenario, maybe he adjusts, and then you're just playing poker. And I think we get an extra meta edge if we're in the habit of doing that exactly. Because we're going to be used to that dance. Our opponent probably won't be. So not only I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but none of them are really part of poker strategy as such. They're not inherent to poker strategy. They're meta elements. They're parts of the metagame. So I don't think we'll say too much about them. We'll save that for another video, probably a different series. How does this relate to your opponent's styles and mistake tendencies? Well, the rock, paper, scissors effect, it correlates exactly with the three basic mistake tendencies or mistake propensities or kind of archetypal villains you can encounter. We could say there's three kinds of mistakes that you can tend to, or your opponent can tend to. Maybe you could just say there's like overly laggy players, there's nitty players, and there's passive stationy players. And those three players form an exact non-linear hierarchy that is not at all unlike rock, paper, and scissors. And it goes something like this. Lag or maniac is greater than nit or tag, or nit tag, tight player. So loose aggressive lag or maniac beats tight player. Tight player like tag, nit, tight aggressive player is greater than stationy passive checky collie player, and the checky collie stationy passive player that doesn't like to bet raise or that just calls, doesn't like to bet, doesn't like to raise, doesn't like to fold, that makes a lot of calling mistakes, that's going to be the kind of player that beats the maniacal opponent. So the more maniacal your opponent is, the more of the calling station you should be. In every way. I don't just mean not fold. I also mean not raise, not re-raise. Do a lot of calling, a lot of exactly calling against your maniacal opponents. Against your tight opponents, like your tags and nits, you want to do a lot of aggressive actions. Take a lot of aggressive lines against them. You want to become a maniac. Bluff the hell out of them. And against a calling station, a passive player, passive fish, whatever you want to call them, we should be tight and aggressive, like nitty against their raises and aggressive against their calls, like a tag. So it forms that same nonlinear hierarchy. Your like kind of three main mistake propensities or tendencies, or your main three archetype of players form this exact nonlinear hierarchy. And so I just want to finish with a couple real-life examples. So, if you haven't caught on to this, the violet color, that's always been talking about the rock, paper, scissors nonlinear hierarchy stuff, and that red color is that dark red is talking about the puller versus bluff catcher, or the ace, king, queen game. So let's use a couple of real-life examples, and we'll end here. What if we have an opponent who just, say he bets the flop and you call, and he pots the turn and you call. You get to the river and he goes all in for another pot-sized bet. If you have a bluff catcher, what should you do? If he underbluffs the river, so let's say he's got a pot-sized bet behind, and he bluffs less than 1/3 of the time, so he has more than 2 hands that beat your hand. For every 1 bluff that you beat, then you should exactly fold your hand. And I don't mean that you should fold most of your hands. You should fold all of the hands that beat bluffs. If your opponent underbluffs by any percent, so he's in this, let's say he check raises the flop, he bombs the turn, and he jams the river. What should we do against that player if it's a pot-sized jam? Well, if we have a bluff catcher, so we're exactly beating his bluffs and losing to his value hands. Say he does this with sets on the flop and draws on the flop, and he's going to continue doing it with the draws that brick and the draws that don't brick. But let's say half the draws come in, and he's also got all these sets, and it just makes it so when he gets to the river, he's in a situation where just based on the run out, he just doesn't have enough bluffs left. He bombs all in, full pot. He set up his ranges so he'd on average, have about 2 value hands for every 1 bluff, but a lot of his bluffs became value hands by the river. Well, this is a situation where if you have something like top pair, you can just fold it, and you should fold your entire range. If your range looks like, if it's capped at 2 pair, but his value range is say any set or better, and if you have nothing but 2 pair or worse in your range, I mean, even if it's capped and bounded, so like you have a lot of hands that beat all of your opponent's bluffs, it doesn't matter. As long as your opponent is not bluffing often enough to make your bluff catches break even or better, you can't call with any of your bluff catchers. So if your opponent is under bluffing by any percent, don't bluff catch against him. And that can be it can be the way the board ran out, because he had a range advantage, or maybe you were ahead on when you called the flop, but the turn made his range a little stronger. You were maybe at parity, and then the river card came out, and it just gave him a range advantage, and he can just, maybe he's in a spot where he can just bet everything. But let's just say it doesn't really matter. He gets here and he doesn't have as many bluffs as you need him to have in order for you to break even with your bluff catchers. You should fold them all. I mean, a polarized range effectively turns all of your bluff catchers into the same hand. A lot of times, if a player takes a range capping line, his opponent can polarize their range in a way that turns all of their hands, all of the bluff catchers, into the same hand, and then they can exploit that opponent. So if it's either just the way the board ran out, or if it's just a tendency that you know about your opponent, if you know that this particular opponent does not bluff often enough, then you should not fold some of your bluff catchers. You should fold them all. And what if the villain that you're up against overfolds the flop? So you bet half the pot with your C-bets, but he folds, say, 55% of the time. Then how often should you bluff? Well, if you can keep doing that, you should bluff always. You should bet all of your air. If you can bet half pot and you can get folds from, 50% of his range, then your hands, your bluffs are simply going to be strictly better as bets than they would be as checks. So you should always bluff. That's a binary adjustment. Now, that doesn't mean you should bet everything, because maybe you've got some other hands that you'd like to not bet, but as far as bluffs, you should bet them, or air, you should bet it. And the real key, the main thing I wanted to get across here, is it's not like if your opponent folds a little too often that you should bluff a little more often. It's not if your opponent folds a little too often, you should bluff a little more often, and that if your opponent bluffs a little less often, you should fold your bluff catchers a little more often. It means what I'm trying to say is, if your opponent folds a little too often against your bluffs, you should always bluff. You should use all of them. And if your opponent folds a little too often against your bluffs, you should use all of your bluffs. Or the opposite, if he underbluffs, you should overfold. By how much? By all of it. And if a villain overbluffs on the river, then you should bluff catch all of your bluff catchers. You should call always. Now, we've got to be clear about the definitions. When I say he's underbluffing, I'm talking about given the bet size, the pot, the price he's laying you and himself. Given that, is he still underbluffing or overbluffing, underfolding or overfolding? So that's the rock, paper, scissors, and ace, king, queen games kind of laying on top of each other. Last example. Button opens, big blind calls, flop goes check, bet, raise, call, turn goes bet, call, river goes bet. Now the river bet is a pot size jam. and every bet and raise subsequent, like before that, is also pot sized. Who's the polarized player and who's the bluff catcher? Well, the guy that check raises the flop is playing the polarized range. The guy that calls is the bluff catcher. The same thing is true on the turn. And the same thing is true on the river. How do we play at Nash equilibrium? Well, at this decision point, we would exactly call with 50% of our bluff catchers to keep our opponent indifferent between bluffing or not. And as the polarized range player, we would bet 2 value hands for every 1 bluff. Now, how would we exploit? What if we know that villain is not, like we're bluff catching, villain is, let's say, not bluffing 1 hand for every 2 hands he's value betting. He's bluffing almost as many. Like say he's got 2 bluffs for every 3 value hands and he's made a pot-sized jam. And you've got a bluff catcher that beats all of his bluffs but loses to all of his value hands. How often should you call? Which bluff catcher should you use? You should call with all of them. You're getting 2 to 1, and you're going to win more often than that. Okay, what if he's under bluffing by any percent? Instead of having 2 value hands and 1 bluff, he's got 2.5 value hands for every 1 bluff. Now how often should we call with a bluff catcher? Never. We should fold our range. So I think that's just going to do it, guys. Thanks for watching. Till next time, Navinata No Limit, saying good, quote, L-U-C-K, end quote, and namaste, bitches. I mean that. Really, I do. From the bottom of my heart, man.